Hey everyone, welcome to Apogee Up Close. I'm Irfan Baqui. I'm a customer engineer with Google Cloud. I work very closely with our customers to help them make better cloud decisions, cloud architectural decisions, and also better API management decisions. And today we'll be talking about how to think beyond the gateway. Let's start with the objective, right? What we'll be discussing today and what you'll be getting out of this talk is how to be successful with your APIs and have a well-thought strategy driving your API program. And just to clear a few buzzwords here, by strategy, I really mean looking at not just your APIs, but your entire business and looking at the metrics that you're using to drive your business forward and connect your APIs to help you achieve those metrics, right? So that as a whole is what we call a strategy. And an API program is just a collaboration between your multiple groups, multiple functions within your organization to really drive the strategy. So here's the agenda. I'll start by setting the context by giving an example of what a successful API program looks like. And I'll do it through telling you about one of our customers that has been thinking very innovatively about the API strategy and their journey through multiple years on iterating through it and really being successful in the API program. Then we will pivot and we'll talk about how APIs fit into your company's architecture and what different approaches you can take to build your API program. Security, as we see it, is a core component of any API strategy. We'll talk about that as well. And finally, we'll tie all of this together into the main subject of today's call, how to look beyond the API gateway and really think about API management as a whole to drive your API program. And then we'll end with questions and answers. Let's dive right into it, right? So the successful API program I want to talk to you about was of Walgreens. And it's a very interesting story. Back in the days, Walgreens started as a classic brick and mortar chain of pharmacies. And really it was no different than any other mom and pop pharmacy. The difference was the scale. They had more than 8,000 stores. And the metric that they boasted was that they had a store within 5-mile distance of 75% of the US population. That would have been a success criteria, right? Because that's how you could tell how many people Walgreens could reach. And if they were able to reach those people, they would be able to sell things to them, and that's how they're successful. But with the advent of the digital age, we're all familiar with how Amazon has been disrupting a lot of different retailers, right? The classic story is how Amazon started disrupting Walmart and how Walmart really had to form a unique strategy to fight back. Walgreens was a little different. They were ahead of the game, and it basically started as somewhat of what I would call a coincidence, right? So within the Walgreens, if you've ever been in one of the stores, they have a photo lab where people back in the days would go in to develop their photo rolls and get the pictures out, right? So with the advent of smartphones around 2008, people stopped using the photo roll cameras, and the smartphones were smart enough to take pretty decent quality images at that time. So one of the ways Walgreens was benefiting from the photo labs was that people would come in to develop their pictures, and as a result they would buy something else as well, right? So the foot traffic was very beneficial to them. But with the advent of smartphones, then that had gone down. So they needed to think about the customer and what they wanted, why did they go away, and figure out how they can get them back. Turned out that they were still looking for a way to print their digital photos. So what they did was they created a native application to let the end users upload their pictures to their app and pick them up developed at a nearby Walgreens store. To do this, they had to create and expose the necessary APIs to the internal developers, right, so that they could create that application. So that was good. That restored some of their traffic, not all of it, right? So they said, all right, is there another bigger opportunity for us to get more foot traffic into our stores? So they looked at how exactly were the end users interacting with their photos, right? What additional things were they doing it? What other additional applications were they using to enhance their pictures? It turned out that there were a plethora of other mobile and web applications where users would upload their photos, for example, for holiday cards, and they would decorate the card with their photos and all of that. Ultimately, they would want to print it out. So they said, all right, how can I tap into those applications and somehow incentivize the developers of those applications to have those photos printed at a nearby Walgreens, right? It solved their problem of getting the photos printed, and it gave more foot traffic to Walgreens. So it was, in their mind, a win-win situation. So what they did was, now they expanded the API program to expose the APIs to partners, so that they could incorporate them into their application, and really created an ecosystem. So this ecosystem, it started with photo APIs and expanded into a bunch of other services that they could offer, like prescription refills to medical and healthcare applications, like purchasing their in-store merchandise with a partner like Postmates, like integrating Walgreens reward programs into other partner applications and all of that. So now with expanding into an ecosystem, they were able to really extend their reach from one or a handful of native applications into hundreds of partner applications. And that's huge. That was, as a whole, an example of a successful API program, right? But what made Walgreens API program successful? I think the simple answer is that they had a relentless focus on developers and customers, right? They started with their customers first. They thought about what exactly they wanted, and they gave it to them. And the method of giving it to them was through APIs, but it was still connected to their business strategy. There were two essential parts that played a huge role, and one of them was a developer portal and incentives, and this is how they communicated with their developers, with their partners. In addition to just exposing the APIs, they also exposed an incentive program to them. They said that, hey, for every dollar, for example, I'm just making numbers up, but for every dollar of revenue that you bring in to the photo prints API, for example, I will incentivize you 10 cents. So now there were a lot of developers that were making net new photo applications just to make revenue out of this program. So it was very popular. The second one was analytics. Once the APIs were being consumed, the way they really gauged how the users and the developers were accessing, consuming the APIs, gave them intel on how they could make them better. So these two components were crucial beyond just creating and exposing those APIs. So let's tie this back into how you should think about your API program, right? There are multiple different approaches to build an API program, but it really boils down to two major ones. One is a tactical approach, and the other one is a more strategic approach. So let's talk about both of them and see what are the pros and cons. So let's talk about a tactical one first. Let's make it a fun exercise, all right? Let's say you have a CEO or CTO of your company come to you to say that, hey, I've got an idea. We have this API service that we should really broadcast out to our partners. It would be a mutually beneficial move both to us and the partners, right? And he gives you the task to make that happen. How do you do it? So let's say now you are following the tactical approach. The first thing you'll do is you'll identify the service and you'll say, hey, how do I expose this out to, let's say, just one external application for now. And the solution you come to is just open up a firewall port, right? And obviously you will need some security in front of the service to make sure that you're allowing just the people that should be allowed to access it. But that's a solution. All right, you open up the firewall port, you add the security policy there. The next thing is, what about rogue applications, right? They can really crash your system if they call it too frequently. In that case, you would just add a rate limiting functionality and call it a day. Next, what if each API call needs data from multiple backends? How would you take care of that? Let's say you have some orchestration being performed so that an API call comes in, talks to 3, 4, any number of different backends, gets the response back, mashes it up, and passes it back to that calling application. Now, do you see what might be a problem with this strategy? What's not in focus here? Well, the customer is not in focus, right? You are really thinking about that particular service and how you would expose it out, but you're not really thinking about who is a customer and what experience you actually want to give them. Now let's take a look at a more strategic way to look at your APIs. What you're seeing on the screen right now is what we call a digital value chain, which encompasses all of the different entities that would eventually, in one way or the other, interact with your APIs. On the left, you have your users. On the right, you have your backend systems, right? So traditionally, what people did was think about it from more of an exposure point of view. And that's what I illustrated in the previous example. You have a service, and you're just thinking about, how do I expose this out? I would mitigate some of the problems around it, like security and rate limiting that we talked about, but essentially you just want to expose it out. But on the other hand, the success pattern that we have seen is the opposite, right? Think about the users first. So when your user is sitting on their table, opening up their laptops or interacting with their mobile application, what is the experience that you want to give them? Once you have identified that particular experience, then you have to think about what kinds of applications would give them those experiences, right? And those applications would then be made by developers. So essentially, you want to make sure you're giving absolutely awesome APIs to your developers so that they don't need to worry about the complexities of your systems, and they can really focus on the experiences that they're building for the end users. And that's really in the hands of an API team. A lot of you on the call might be part of such an API team. You would really make sure that you're focusing on the end user and also on your developer first in creating those APIs, designing those APIs such that they are addressing their needs. And eventually then you would connect those APIs to your backends, right? That's where all of the interesting data and logic of your enterprise resides. So you would connect them to the backends to get the data, execute the logic, and all of that. This is how you would strategically view your APIs, but this also poses a problem, right? And that problem is from a security standpoint. We talked about all of these entities being part of the digital value chain, but the more entities you have, the more effort you need to put in to make sure that they're secure. For example, on the left, you can have a legitimate end user, or you can have a hacker, or you can have a bot, some bad actor that really wants to abuse your API. You can have really any application on the internet interacting with your APIs. So how do you identify that it's the right application that you have authenticated? How do you deprovision access of that application to your system if needed? So all of that's important. On the developer side, who are the developers that are consuming your APIs, right? Are they registered? Do you know them? Are you able to track them well? And if needed, are you able to drop them from your API program? Are you able to deprovision them? For your APIs, are they secure enough at runtime, right? Are they following the best practices and standards that your organization has laid out, both from a regulatory and from a compliance standpoint? And finally, your backend systems. Is the data coming in and out of your backend systems coming in and out securely? Is it secure? Is it encrypted at rest? Is it encrypted in flight? And all of that. And how do you also make sure that you're protecting your backend systems from a sudden overload in the API call volume? So let's look at how an intelligent API management platform would mitigate some of these threats and make sure that your strategy is also taking care of security. So at Apogee, we actually make sure that each of these entities are thought about cohesively. For example, for the end user, you would need behavior-based security to identify the patterns, how they're calling your APIs, and classify them as either bad actors or legitimate users, right? You'd also want signature-based security to protect your systems against the well-known OWASP attacks. And you might also want to do some fine-grained control, like looking at the payload complexity and making sure that it adheres to a particular schema that you have defined for requests coming in. You may also want to protect your backend systems from some abusive users if they're calling you APIs too frequently and have them spike arrested. So you can do all of that on the end user side. Also for the applications, you would want to make sure that you're identifying them. You're authenticating them through industry standard OAuth 2 protocols, and you are restricting them or authorizing them to access just the APIs that you give them access to. Now for developers, you may want to make sure that these are your trusted employees or partners, and to do so you can authenticate them through an identity provider like Okta or Ping Federate. Now, talking about your APIs and API teams, you would want to make sure that your API teams have access to only the APIs and even the functionalities within those APIs that they should have access to. And teams like your security team are able to set blanket policies for all of your APIs to make sure that your system is secure. You'd be able to do all of that with an API management platform like Apogee. Lastly, talking about your backend systems, you would want to make sure that the connection to them is secure through something like mutual TLS and IP whitelisting, and the data that flows in and out is encrypted, both on the wire and at rest. So we talked about how to really look at your API program strategically, right? Thinking about the users first and also thinking about security as you are doing it. So what exactly is needed for you to be able to do so? The first is through developer management, right? Having a portal where your developers can come in and learn more about your API program. Maybe part of it is your documentation. Other part of it is monetization, incentives to use your APIs. Maybe it also has an integration to your support portal, whatever that is, but any way for you to quickly onboard and engage your partners and developers. Next is analytics, right? So as they start consuming your APIs, you want to see how exactly they're consuming it, right? Where are the end users located? How are they using the applications? So you can look at all of that data and make your API program better. The next is operations automation. So as your API program grows and scales, you shouldn't really need to worry about the operations yourself, right? You worry about the APIs, you worry about your products, and the operations and everything else should just happen. Next is API development. As you're developing these APIs, one thing to note is that they would have to be developed quickly, right? Your developers and their innovation actually depends on how fast you're rolling out features. So that would mean that ideally you would have pre-baked policies like we provide in Apogee, drag and drop, really quickly change the APIs, iterate them, version them, and go to market faster. And finally, a secure and flexible API runtime so that you can process the incoming requests and the responses going out. So all of this together is really a core part of a good API management platform. These are features and functionalities actually that you get right now in Apigee. And one thing to note is that a very tiny portion of this functionality is an API gateway. So tying this back to the original idea of our talk today, thinking beyond the API gateway, when you really think about the users first and make sure you are tying your API strategy into your business strategy, then you would need an intelligent API management platform to drive that API program. All right, at this point, I will end the presentation and open it up to questions.
And also, I actually just changed the microphone, so I hope you guys can hear me well. There's another question about whether or not there's a trial available. You can go on the Apigee website and sign up for a free trial. You can try out the platform yourself. Let's see what you mentioned incentives and monetization as part of an API strategy. Can you talk more about what kinds of incentive programs you've seen? That's a great question, actually. So there are, in Apigee, we have a monetization module, and there are a variety of ways that we've actually seen our customers incorporate incentives and monetization into the API programs. For example, one is the classic way of charging for your APIs, right? So you may say that, hey, for every 10 API calls, I'll charge you $0.01, right? So you can do all of that right from the platform itself. The other way is to incentivize developers so that for every $1 of revenue they bring in, you would incentivize them $0.01 or 10 cents. The other interesting way we have seen customers use this is also internally to their companies. So think about a large organization, an organization like Google, right? That would have a lot of different sub-organizations or business units underneath it. Usually those business units, they have their own plans, strategies, and all of that, but they need to communicate with each other, and they're consuming each other's APIs. So in that case, they would use monetization to balance their cost centers. And that's how they demonstrate the ROI and the value of the APIs when they look at their metrics. So I hope that answers your question. The next one is, what's a typical developer onboarding flow out there? So it really depends on what your intent is, right, for developers. But typically, what you want is to make consumption of your APIs really seamless for them. So when they come onto the portal, they should know exactly what to do, where to go. So developer portals that actually we provide as part of Apigee, they come with that standard developer flow, developer onboarding flow inbuilt, right? So when the customers come in without really signing up, they'll be able to look at your documentation. They might even be able to try out some APIs with pre-provisioned API keys that hit your sandbox environment, right? And at that point, now you're really gaining their trust. They're getting more comfortable using your product, and they're saying, hey, I would actually like to integrate these APIs into my application. At that point, then, you would direct them to sign up for your portal, for your APIs. You would give them a way to really, for the appropriate APIs, get access to them without really interfacing with your team, right? And get the credentials so that they can really start consuming those APIs. And then you might have different plans in place, and you can monitor their threshold and see what kind of usage they're driving. And once they run past a certain threshold, then maybe you contact your sales teams contact them and turn that low-touch relationship that has already built trust in them into a more high-touch, white-glove relationship and to form more of a strategic bond and partnership. So hopefully that answers your question. What are the most common pitfalls you've seen with companies who are getting started? That's a great question. I actually talk with a lot of companies that have started to think about the API programs in a tactical manner, right? And in doing so, then they have built some tools themselves, like lightweight gateways. Maybe they use some open source gateways, and they broadcast these APIs without really thinking about the customers and developers first, right? And now those APIs are out there, a certain experience is out there, and they reach a certain stage where they feel like, hey, we really need a strategic view on these vital business assets. So at that point, then it calls for a transition from the tactical to a strategic approach, which sometimes is painful, right? So what I really recommend to my customers is that start with the right tool up front, right? No matter what scale you want to start your API program at, if you have the right tools, then you would be able to start small, but still have all the potential and capabilities at your fingertips to expand as you see the opportunity coming. Hopefully that answers the question. Let's see, how can we use this platform for APIs microservices, which we don't want to expose publicly, but want internal apps to communicate? That's a great question. So nowadays, since the past about three, four years, the lines between an external app and an internal app has actually blurred quite a bit, so that we don't really differentiate between the two. Mainly because if you're looking at microservices, the definition of that is that these are disparate teams that are working on this a single microservice or a bunch of different microservices that have contracts with other teams and other microservices that they're dependent on. What that also means is that now there is a consumer-provider relationship between the teams of all these microservices. So an API, a good, well-thought-out API program that is even more necessary internally to make sure that there is no redundant work being done. There's a lot of reuse, and people are able to really identify the APIs and the different assets and quickly leverage them as they're building their own services. And obviously the communication, SLA, and all of that should be part of the API program as well, just as much for the internal developers as we talked about today for external developers. Hopefully that answers your question. Do you have various products like gateway, micro gateway, service mesh, or are they all the same things? What's the difference between them? It's a great question. Think of Apigee as an API management platform that would encompass your digital API strategy, both for an internal as well as an external use case. And as part of the platform now, you have tools at your disposal, like the micro gateway and the Istio adapter, to really connect the different architectures that you have in place, right? And bring them under the same umbrella. Let me give you an example, make it more concrete. Maybe you have, maybe you are embarking on a journey right now to split up your monoliths and create a service mesh with a bunch of different microservices. In that case now, even for your high throughput microservice to microservice traffic, especially now that you're using some cutting edge technologies like Istio, you would want API management and the intelligence of the customer come in right into your mesh, right? And Apigee provides tools for that. Maybe you have more of a service-oriented architecture. For that reason, you want to have an externalized gateway that they all interface with. Apigee provides a tool for that. Maybe you have an architecture that calls for a sidecar approach, but it's not really containerized, right? You still have VM-based applications, and you want to keep those calls within your network. Then Apigee provides a tool for that, which is a micro gateway. But at a whole, don't really. I would recommend not to get too focused on the tools from the get-go, right? From the tiny details from the get-go. Think about your API program on a high level first. See what architectures you have, and then look at the tools that we have that would fit for each one of those architectures. Because at the end of the day, all of your APIs would be under the same umbrella. Hopefully that answers your question. There is another one that says, what's the preferred development way? Is it offline or through the GUI? The GUI is really good, especially because it's very visual, right? It doesn't matter if you're a developer or a product manager. You would be able to go in, look at how an API is designed in the GUI and be able to understand what exactly is going on, right? Even for debugging purposes, you can use the trace tool and figure out what exactly is going on for each API call that is being captured in the trace tool. But for your day-to-day, Apigee will integrate into your CI/CD process. And once you get used to developing on Apigee, really you'd be able to start using your local IDE for development purposes, push to a development branch, then push to a QA branch, automatically promote your changes to staging, so on and so forth. So whatever SDLC lifecycle you have there, Apigee would integrate with it. Hopefully that answers your question. API governance. Rules around how to govern API development and use inside and outside of the company. That's a great question. And this ties back into what I mentioned about security, right? To make sure that there's proper governance around your API program, you want to make sure that you have proper teams that are part of your API program. And one of them would be a security team. And what Apigee provides you is a place to define blanket governance policies so that your developers that are developing the APIs, they don't have to worry about security and all of that. But these blanket policies would then be applied to all of your APIs to make sure that they are abiding by the security and the regulatory compliance requirements of your organization. And each call that comes in is going through all of those policies. Hopefully that answers your question. The next one is there a critical mass for API management platform? How do you right size to smaller teams? I would say it doesn't really matter what the size of your team is, right? If you look at some of the startups right now in the Valley, they start out with a handful of team members, but they're disrupting giant organizations. And that's because they're agile enough to really think about the users first and iterate on their program really fast and make it successful. Same thing applies to bigger companies now. So Walgreens example was the same thing, right? They disrupted themselves by giving developers the opportunity to use their APIs into their applications to do a bunch of different things. And in turn, they got the foot traffic and they sold more merchandise. So regardless of the size of your teams, you should be thinking about your API program more strategically. The next question is, do you recommend using a single API management for external APIs and internal APIs, or separate? If single, how could that be done? Great questions. API management, as I mentioned before, right now, the line is being blurred between an external API and an internal API. And what I'm seeing more and more now is that teams are building their internal APIs that other internal microservices interact with the intention that that API can also be exposed outside. The zero trust model is gaining more popularity for the right reasons. And that says that, hey, even if my services is within my firewall, I'm not going to trust anyone within my firewall. I would want to make sure that I'm authenticating people properly and proper authorizations are in place for them to access my service. So all of this scrutiny now, and also all of these needs to serve the internal developers the same way as you would serve the external developers are really blurring the lines between internal and external APIs. So the short answer is you would definitely need a single API management platform for both the use cases, because at the end of the day, you want a central pane for visibility and a central pane where your developers would be able to come in and discover your APIs. The next question is cloud versus on-prem versus hybrid. What is the best strategy? There, I can provide my viewpoint on this. Obviously, a lot also depends on the individual organization, individual company. But the way I see it now, and more since the past couple of years, is that companies are going private cloud, which is on-premise, mostly because of two reasons. One is a compliance reason, right? It's not a security reason, it's a compliance reason. And second is if they have cracked the code of operations. If they are in the business of operating large-scale infrastructure themselves, then maybe it makes sense for them to go on-premise. But essentially now, the way I look at Google Cloud and also Apigee is not just a infrastructure as a service or a software as a service, but really as a security company, right? Not only do we provide security tools for our customers, but we ourselves make sure that we have dedicated high-quality security teams that are proactively identifying ways to improve and mitigate threats that are out there. So from a security perspective, I'm actually seeing a lot of the larger banks and healthcare companies now moving to the cloud, right? Because they see that a company dedicated to security might be able to do a really good job on securing their services versus them really building those teams in-house. In hybrid, in the same vein as on-premise, if you have compliance reasons so that you want to operate the runtimes on your premises, then you would go with hybrid. There's no real reason in most industries to go outside of public cloud because of latency issues. Because in the past year and a half now, the speeds at which the calls go through from our data center or from Google Cloud to other public cloud, or from Google Cloud to your on-premises is really fast. And there are solutions like piping the two data centers together to even to increase that speed even more. So there's really no reason, even from a latency perspective, that for most companies that I see warrants them to go non-cloud. The next question is, what is the strategy for putting unmanaged APIs under API management? Great question, great question. So this is where most companies would start, right? They would already have a bunch of APIs, and now they want to bring them under the umbrella of an API management platform and have the visibility and discovery and traffic management, all of those good things that come with it. The first step is just to do a pass-through proxies on those APIs so that your end user experience is not really impacted, right? They're the same APIs, and they're just going through Apigee now. So that will immediately, in a very agile way, solve the problem of analytics and visibility. You'll be able to see now who's calling your APIs and whatnot. And second, it will solve the problems of developer onboarding and discovery and all of that. And then over time, you can version those APIs, you can make them better, and really think about iterating on them with your users and developers in mind. Hopefully that answers your question. Let's see. I will take one last question. It is how API discovery and registry is addressed in Apigee. So API discovery and registry is through a developer portal, right? Your developers will be able to come in, and I think I mentioned this in one of the prior answers. Your developers would be able to come in and really interact with your brand. You'll be able to see what you stand for and all of that. And along the way, they can see what services you offer, read the documentations of your APIs, try them out right on the portal itself, and easily then integrate them into their own applications. All right. At this point, I will take your leave. It was a great Q&A session. I hope this talk was beneficial to you. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out. I would love to be connected with you. Take care. Thank you.